Hi, everyone. I ran across a person the other day who was telling me a story, and we'd gone from a series of unfortunate topics, ended up on talking about all the riots and the chaos that's happening in the sort of racially charged atmosphere that we're in now. And this person was, we were talking about police brutality, and this person had said to me, well, perhaps it's a matter of education. And they were relaying a story to me of a young woman who is training to be a police officer, and how they had gotten into a discussion of Black Lives Matter, and she responded with the phrase, all lives matter. And this is a common response, of course, to the phrase Black Lives Matter. Now, to be clear, in this video, I'm going to respond to the phrase or the sentiment Black Lives Matter as Black Lives Matter. And when I refer to the organization Black Lives Matter, I'm going to refer to them as BLM, just to keep the two things distinct for the purposes of this discussion. So this person who was telling me about her response, all lives matter, rolled his eyes and saying, I'm going to have to, now I had to educate her on why that's not an appropriate response to Black Lives Matter. And I cringed a little bit at this because I've done a lot of thinking about these things, and I feel like we've lost, as a society, we seem to have lost our sense of skepticism. And so when a person, hears a narrative and it sounds good, it seems like they accept it unquestioningly. And I would suggest and submit to you that given the agendas at play and all of the political undertones to everything, it would behoove us all to sort of not just accept things at face value when they're said to us in this way. And so, I let him tell his story, but I thought a little bit more about this, and I thought, the common response then to that all lives matter is that, no, you don't understand why we're saying Black Lives Matter. What we're saying is it's akin to, and they will liken it to a neighborhood with a bunch of houses, and a house is on fire. They would say you wouldn't call the fire department and say, send your resources to every house on this block. You would direct them to the house that's on fire. And this is akin to, of course, the notion that Black lives are under threat and they're being hunted down by the police on a daily basis, et cetera, et cetera. And so in that sense, all lives matter is a very inappropriate response to Black Lives Matter. And so, if we accept that on its face, it does seem very reasonable. And again, keeping that separate and distinct from BLM, because a lot of people will demand that you proclaim allegiance to BLM, that stating that Black Lives Matter is not good enough in and of itself. You need to pledge an allegiance to this political organization. And I would say that's your first clue that something is afoot. The other thing is that Black Lives Matter as a sentiment carries with it an implicit assumption that whoever you're speaking to potentially thinks that Black lives don't matter. And I would say that that's not particularly fair as it relates to an individual, for one thing, but also civilization or the citizens at large, and even the police organizations at large. I don't think that's a fair sentiment to say that they think that Black lives do not matter, but it goes deeper than that. And I started thinking about this. A few people have posted on my Facebook some of the stories that come out of places like Chicago, the inner city, where on any given weekend you can have more Black lives lost through shootings and other things like that than there are unarmed Black men, say, killed by the police in the entirety of the country for a whole year. Like a bad weekend in Chicago can be far worse of a toll on Black lives than an entire year of police altercations. And so I started wondering, when people post this, and oftentimes they're more tragic deaths. So I'm not saying that one life is worth more than another, although, if you got into specifics, you might be able to make that case. But in terms of tragedy, I think you could easily make that case that a 1-year-old or a 3-year-old or a 6-year-old that's caught in the crossfire and gets killed, ultimately, that's more of a tragic death than, let's say, someone who's involved in criminal activity that ends up having a confrontation with police, and either through sort of an act that's really sort of a manslaughter, or even an act of self-defense by the police officer shoots and kills this person, that's less tragic than the 1, 3, or 6-year-old that gets caught in the crossfire. But there are a lot of the proportionality is quite different as well. And it's interesting that we don't hear BLM talk too much about that. And that prompted me, I thought about it and I thought, it's interesting to me to note that the phrase adopted by BLM is Black Lives Matter. And it's not all Black Lives Matter. Now, this could be just, very simple. It could be innocent enough that the person who coined that phrase in the beginning just never thought that deeply about it, and they just said Black Lives Matter. Or, it could be something more sinister, and in some ways, by their fruits ye shall know them, I guess, because when it comes to BLM, they don't really campaign for all Black lives. And that's evidenced by the fact that they don't pay that much attention to what's going on in the inner city with intra-racial violence. And so if we circle back to this analogy about, a neighborhood with one house on fire, it seems as though the real situation is that there's another entire block that's completely engulfed in flames, but we're not calling fire department resources in on that because it was sparked by an arsonist or a band of arsonists or something such as that. A different analogy I might put forth would be something akin to a triage idea. You go to an emergency room in a hospital and you've got, a few patients there with some minor lacerations and a broken arm or a bruise or something, or the flu. And then you've got someone who comes in who's in a coma or is bleeding out from a bunch of gunshot wounds. And, the triage nurse comes out and says, you, and you, come with me. And not only doesn't take the coma patient and the person that's bleeding out, but doesn't even acknowledge them at all. It would be akin to something like that. And keep in mind, the severity of the injuries here is not, I'm not using that as an analog for the severity of injuries in these intraracial interactions or police and black interactions. I'm using those as an analog for the proportions, right? There's far more black lives lost to this interracial violence and whatnot than by a long shot than there are with police interactions. And it's as though they're just not paying attention to that at all. The other thing that we need to keep in mind is that when it comes to the police, we charge them with keeping the public peace, and that means, of course, responding. They have to be going into to an armed robbery while everyone else is running away from an armed robbery, for instance. And so, because they are again the agency with the monopoly on the use of force, and we are charging them with keeping the public peace, they are more likely to end up in confrontations with people, black, white, or otherwise, that could end up being violent because, of course, these people don't want to be arrested for what they're doing. And so these interactions are in the commission of something that we have asked them to do. And you also have to, of course, separate out manslaughter from accidental killings, from murder, which would be an unjustified intentional killing, and, of course, acts of self-defense. I mean, a police officer is charged with official duties. They're to operate within policy guidelines, but they are never stripped of their right to defend their life in the event that someone is trying to take their life. And so, just like any citizen, they are allowed to defend their life if their life is being put directly in jeopardy. And so, the commission of any of those kinds of murders, justified killings, manslaughter, or self-defense, those are all under the umbrella of the commission of what we've asked them to do in terms of policing. Whereas in the inner city, I mean, there's nobody there who's been, unless they're self-appointed or, it's sort of each specific gang has their own rules about what they're going to do. Nobody there has been officially charged with keeping the public peace. Nobody there has been officially tasked with approaching another person with arms to cause them to conform to some dictate. So in that sense, that any confrontations, violent confrontations that happen in the inner city and subsequent death that results for them, it's hard to make the case that any of that would be acceptable legally, right? And so these two things aren't necessarily comparable. And again, it's difficult to have an honest adult conversation about that without someone getting incited. But this is not to sort of set aside any malice on the part of an individual police officer who may harbor racist intentions. That needs to be addressed. So this argument is not to sort of overlook that in the slightest. But what is being overlooked, I think, in particular, is this intraracial violence that BLM tends to ignore in a lot of the inner cities and elsewhere, of course. I got into a little bit of a conversation about this with a black YouTuber who, he's quite well known in the flat earth community. That is, he's a flat earth debunker. He uses science and argumentation to debunk all the people who promote the idea that the earth is flat. And he's pretty good at it. His YouTube channel of late seems to have devolved into just the racial politics now in light of everything that's happened. And I find that a little bit sad. In some ways, I don't feel like I don't think he's the person for it, because he seems to be too emotionally invested in the arguments. And that's not good when you're trying to reach a rational conclusion. And I think that's part of what we've lost as a society. The ability to dispassionately discuss and have debate with empirical evidence and come to rational conclusions about things. Everything is narrative building and very heated debates, and that's not how you reach sober conclusions, unfortunately. The data either is massaged or ignored, or statistics are abused in order to make certain points. And oftentimes the narratives do not reflect what's actually occurring on the ground. A good example would be the narrative "hands up, don't shoot," which is sort of the narrative surrounding the Mike Brown killing. But that's not actually what happened. Eyewitnesses on the ground, including black eyewitnesses, state that this is not what occurred at all, and that Mike Brown actually was violently attacking the police officer and was charging him. So these narratives don't help. These narratives only fuel the emotionality of the situation, and this black YouTuber seems to be sort of caught up in that. But the discussion I was having with him was surrounding something that Candace Owens had said, another political pundit who happens to be black, and she's on the conservative side, and she had made a video that many of you may have seen. It got, it went completely viral, where she said that, the black community is unique in that we have a tendency to raise up the criminal element among us and almost martyr them. And that's a problem, and we don't have enough conversations about criminality within our race. And his response to that was, oh, she's not actually representative of the black community. It's the no true Scotsman fallacy, right? I responded to him and I said, oh, the no true Candace fallacy, I think is what I said to him. And that she's just not a part of these conversations. They're happening in certain sequestered regions of the black community, I guess, certain church groups and things like that. And my challenge to him was on the efficacy of these discussions, on how important they really are if no one's hearing of them, if I haven't heard of them, if Candace Owens hasn't heard of them, et cetera, et cetera. And his response to me was that I was being incredibly arrogant by suggesting that just because I hadn't heard of these conversations, that they weren't valid, they weren't meaningful, was the word that was being used. Now, of course, that wasn't my argument, that if I don't hear about something, it's not meaningful in any way. The point of my argument was that if we're not hearing about them, that means they're not, in a pragmatic sense, in a practical way, they're not transforming their situation on the ground. They're not meaningful in the sense that they're not changing the amount of criminality within the black community. So how meaningful are these discussions if they don't result in any meaningful change? And of course, if this is going to be a principle that he is going to put forth, that, just because we haven't heard about these things doesn't mean that they're not meaningful. Sorry. If this is a principle that just because no one's heard of them, it doesn't mean they're not meaningful. Well, sometimes a good way to see if a principle makes sense is to flip it around and aim it the other direction and see if the other person would accept that principle reversed. So if we were to say, in the instance of police brutality and killing of unarmed black men, that we're having these discussions, that police agencies in the various municipalities and regions are having these discussions about what to do about police brutality and killing. It's just that you're not hearing about them. And I don't think he would accept that argument reversed in that way. He would say, well, no, of course, these discussions aren't meaningful if they're not actualized in the real world in a reduction in these kind of violent police interactions, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think this is a valid concern, but I wonder how meaningful any discussions are that relate to them. And again, getting back to the proportions here, a bad weekend in Chicago can equal or surpass all of the police killings of unarmed black men in the entire country for an entire year, and yet BLM doesn't really talk much about that. So I have to ask the question, do all Black lives matter to BLM, or is it just the ones that are politically expedient? Now, I had said this a while back in a video that Black Lives Matter, they're not a group that's interested in racial harmony or even racial justice. I think that these are people who are bent on some form of political power. And that has been confirmed recently by one of the founders of BLM admitting, or basically professing, that they are trained Marxists. And so that's what this group is. This group is gained on seeking some form of political power through social upheaval, through creating class strife, in this case, racial strife, to the point where that creates a power vacuum. And I think they're hoping that they can, from the ashes, derive some sort of political power. It's the same as the defund the police issue. The idea is not to not have any form of policing, to not have an agency with the monopoly on the use of force, which is what our police agencies are. And I would say as an aside, these are all discussions that could be had amongst the citizens of a region and the leaders of that region, which really should be the citizens. But as it relates to this agency, we deem to give a monopoly on the use of force in order to protect the rest of us, as to what constitutes reasonable use of force, what represents reasonable assumption, of guilt, to then further go into a police action, those sorts of things. We can have all those discussions. That's legitimate, and it should be ongoing, I would say. As societies change and whatnot, it would be ridiculous to assume that you could have a static set of policies surrounding policing forever and ever. That would be silly. But groups like BLM and Antifa and some of these other groups, they are not interested in having no group, no agency with a monopoly on the use of force. They just don't like the current agency that has a monopoly on the use of force. And in some ways, this is evidenced by even what happens in these small uprisings like Chaz and CHOP, and I think they tried it in DC as well. It's not as though they have no sort of policing occurring when they take over these autonomous zones. In fact, not only do they have policing, but it's rather renegade in some ways, but it involves things like walls, it involves things like guns, it involves things like muscle. So again, it's not that they don't want an agency with a monopoly on the use of force. They would just rather it be someone of their choosing. The other thing that strikes me about BLM as it relates to all Black Lives Matter versus what is expedient politically for them, what they can get leverage, what they can leverage against, for instance, white guilt in this sense, is if you start to expand your horizons globally. If you start look at what's happening, so they'll talk. There's lots of rhetoric surrounding slavery, and they want to apply slavery to white people. They want to leverage that white guilt and say, well, you once owned our ancestors, your ancestors once owned our ancestors as slaves. Now, not to mention that's a blurring of linear time. We don't live in that era, and no one alive today owned anyone alive today as a slave, all of that stuff. And they want to attach this to white people as some form of original sin. And I would submit to you that if you're going to have the actions of your ancestors sort of placed upon you as inescapable attributes of you yourself, it's interesting that they don't mention the fact that it was white people who actually abolished, took up swords and guns in order to abolish slavery. That original sin, as it were, doesn't get applied to current white people. And I find that interesting to note that there's no acknowledgement of that. The other thing that there's no acknowledgement again of is if you expand your scope globally, is if we're going to talk about slavery, I haven't really heard anybody from BLM mention that there are current slave markets today that you can actually purchase a human being for a few $100s. It will be probably a person of color, very most likely, in 2020. I mean, think about that. You can purchase a human being for a few $100 American in some areas of this world. So do all Black Lives Matter? Now, you could make the argument, and I've had this argument leveled back in response to this, that, well, these are a group of people that, they can't control everything in the world, so they're limiting their scope to the people that they care the most about in their region. And again, if you're going to use this as a principle, then I would have to say that that doesn't really provide a valid argument against, or I should say for, what they're applying to, let's say, white people. And I would argue that's inappropriate. It's not fair, because I think most white people in the Western world are not racist. But even if they were, if you're going to say, well, we're just limiting our scope to the people that we care about in our small region, then why would you expect white people to expand their scope of care and compassion outside of their own group and region? Again, if it's a principle that's going to be universalized, it doesn't make a lot of sense. The other thing is, too, that I've had said is that, oh, well, you're only paying attention, you're only noticing the slavery, let's say, in other regions now because it's expedient to your argument, that you want to find some criticism to have against BLM, and so you're just using this, and how convenient of you to suddenly be concerned about slavery globally. And that's just not true. Very few people who are watching this would know that I involve myself in these discussions, but I've been involved in many philosophical and political discussions on certain message boards for many years, and we have discussed the plight of gays and lesbians, for instance, in other areas of the world that do not have the liberties and freedoms that we enjoy here in the West. We've discussed and railed against, let's say, radical feminists when it comes to the plight of women and girls in certain repressive regimes around the world. And we have, of course, especially since the so-called liberation of Libya by the Democrats, the flourishing of once illegal slave markets in Libya in particular. There's other places, of course, in the world where these take place. And also, let's not forget that is an above-ground slave market, or there are above-ground slave markets that exist in other places of the world. Slavery is, of course, illegal in the Western world. However, there is an underground slave market. It's primarily a sex slave market, probably, although it's hard to know for sure because we don't know all the details, but probably dominated by underage people, probably primarily female, but again, we don't know exactly all of the details there. That's something that has been discussed for a long time amongst people who care about these things and seems to be widely ignored. And there may be other reasons, there may be political reasons why that is the case. There have been a couple of, I'm not going to get into details too much here, but there are obviously several high-profile people who've been allegedly involved in some of these things that have had certain incidents befall them recently. So what is the point of all of this? Well, the point is to just illuminate that BLM is a political organization, and it's probably sort of worse than that. They are Marxist anarchists who seek the destruction of the current political system, and that's not through normal political means. They also, it should be known, seek to disrupt the nuclear family, and they talk a lot about sort of community families and parenting, but one thing they don't mention is fathers. And it should also be noted that the founders of BLM are sort of radical feminists. They don't have a particular passion for men in general, and I don't think fathers in particular. And if you were to do, again, any kind of a sober, rational analysis of the problems in really any community, but in particular in the modern Black community, fatherless homes are a significant factor. And there have been many studies that have shown that, poor outcomes for children, long term, one of the greatest factors in having poor outcomes is single parent homes. And so if you really care about children and their futures, you would care that children are raised in a loving, nonviolent two-parent home where their parents are self-sufficient and not relying on the government, and that they are able to at some point seek and keep a job. Those are all factors that really shape the future for a person, a successful future. And so if you're going to have an adult conversation about those things, you have to look at those factors, and BLM certainly doesn't do that. Ultimately, I think most people want racial harmony. And I think the best gift you can give a stranger, a complete stranger, is your indifference towards arbitrary characteristics that they can't control. Race, gender, sexual orientation, and physical disability, things like that. It would be nice if we could all treat one another as though we are individuals first. And those arbitrary characteristics that don't necessarily inform who that person is as an individual are things that we ought to be indifferent to. And what's happening now in our current climate is that those things are being hyper-focused on. The intersections of all of those arbitrary characteristics are of supreme importance, it would seem, and the individual actually gets lost in all of that. It's a collectivist movement. It is a Marxist collectivist movement, and I think it really would serve us all well to be a little more critical, to engage our critical thinking, be skeptical of these organizations, listen to what they say, watch what they do in particular, and ask yourself, if the goal is some sort of equality or equity, and if the goal is certainly any kind of racial harmony, ask yourself if we're going to get there. Is it even in any way, shape, or form possible for us to get there, to that harmony, given the trajectory that we're on? And I'm including in that trajectory if all demands were met. Police defunding or police reform, reparations made, all kinds of analysis, all kinds of diversity and inclusive and unconscious bias training amongst NASCAR drivers and crews and everyone else. If all of that were to happen, do you think ultimately that BLM will be satisfied, that Antifa will be satisfied, and that racial harmony will be at some point achieved? I think we're worse now than we were 20, 25 years ago. That's another good question to ask. Have we improved racial harmony, or are we going backwards? Are we going to increase the degree of distrust amongst people who can look at one another and make identifications of arbitrary characteristics that don't really impact on the individual? Have we made an improvement in that area? I would submit to you, no, and I don't think BLM is helping. Obviously, Black Lives Matter. I'll go further. All Black Lives Matter. And then I'll say all lives matter. Please tell me what you think, and thanks very much for watching.